Hello everybody and welcome to Drydock episode 27. The competition for 25k subs is now closed. Winners will be being selected, or by the time you're listening to this, will have been selected, and messages sent to them over the forthcoming few days. If by next week's Drydock we haven't managed to contact all the winners, I will try a different form of communication with them, and I guess by the next Drydock, if someone has failed to come forward, it'll be a case of selecting a new winner. Anyway, that little bit of admin exercise done, let's get on with the questions in February's Patreon Q&A. Diego A. Salvati asks, the question that I have is about Zeppelins and their use in naval operations. Mostly interested in how the Germans used them in World War I, but if you could also talk about their interwar and World War II use, that would be much appreciated. So, the Imperial German Army and Navy operated their Zeppelins in two completely separate arms, in two completely separate fashions. It can be somewhat difficult to actually work out whose Zeppelins are whose, because a lot of sources will refer to the Zeppelins by their production numbers, which were LZ and then insert number here, whereas in fact, in addition to the production numbers, the German Army and German Navy had their own tactical numbering systems. So Army Zeppelins were Z1, 2, 3, 4, etc., and Naval Zeppelins were L1, 2, 3, 4, etc. So you have, say, the first German Navy airship L1, which is also LZ14, whereas the German Army's first Zeppelin, Z1, is also LZ3. We'll ignore the German Army one, since you asked about their use in naval operations, and concentrate on the naval airships. German naval airship use didn't get off to the happiest of starts. Both L1 and L2 were lost in accidents before the First World War even began, and took with them the head of that particular branch of the German military, and then his successor, which left them with a bunch of partially trained crews and one Zeppelin. Luckily, they managed to rebuild from this, and obviously the various classes of Zeppelin were developed and further improved upon. So early Zeppelin classes included obviously A class, which was LZ1, and sort of A, B, C, D, etc. So by the time you had got to the World War I period, they were up to the M and N classes of Zeppelins, which would then form the bulk of Zeppelin production, aside from the P class during World War I. So one of the primary roles of a naval Zeppelin was reconnaissance. The Germans were quite quick to appreciate the value of aerial reconnaissance, as were most armies, but of course aircraft reconnaissance, especially in the early war, was limited by the short range and low flight ceiling of the contemporary aircraft, whereas a Zeppelin could operate for considerable time and at considerably higher altitudes, both much superior to early aircraft, and so aircraft like L3 and L4 and so on would partake in numerous reconnaissance missions for the German Navy over the North Sea, with a number of Zeppelins actually assigned to try and scout for the Battle of Jutland, or, well, the operation that eventually turned into the Battle of Jutland, but the weather in that particular case preventing them from doing so. One of the things that was discovered about Zeppelins during this period was that they were actually really good at finding naval mines, because they could obviously float around at relatively low speed, they had very good angles of view, and with the numerous crew on board, they could take advantage of these angles and sunlight to spot the shapes and shadows of mines floating just under the surface, which was something that theoretically you could do in an aircraft, but again, you needed time, and aircraft pilots tend to be a bit distracted with the whole flying and not crashing part of operating a World War I aircraft. Whilst Army airships generally took part in operations over the continent, it would also be primarily naval airships that took part in the attacks on the UK at various times in various naval raids, including one which has a personal family collection for me. So here you see an image of my great-great-grandfather, and he was in London at the time of an attack by a Zeppelin, and whilst everyone else was screaming and running for cover, he decided the best course of action was to take my great-grandfather up to the top of a hill and watch the whole show from up there. Presumably on the basis that since air raid shelters didn't actually exist, it didn't really matter where you stood, and if the Germans were going to bomb anywhere, it was highly unlikely to be a hill in the middle of a park. And so he just watched the whole raid go on until eventually the thing was brought down in flames, which apparently, according to my grandparents, he found rather amusing and satisfying. One other particular mission of note by German naval airships would be the voyage of L-59, also known as LZ-104, aka the Afrika Schiff, and this actually set a distance record as it was sent out as a gigantic flying supply craft for German forces in German East Africa. Unfortunately, halfway through the voyage they discovered that British forces had captured the area they were supposed to be landing in, so they had to abort, but they did succeed in setting a long-distance flight record which stood for quite a while of just over 4,000 miles and nearly 4 days continuously in the air. L-62, aka LZ-107, would also become the only airship known to successfully drive away an attacking airplane by means of its gunnery, as opposed to all other attacks which were either carried through successfully by the aircraft or where the aircraft was forced to break off due to lack of fuel or ammunition. What also has to be appreciated is that whilst from a distance many Zeppelins can look alike, the Germans made remarkable advances in Zeppelin technology during the 4 years of World War I. If we compare 4 of them as a good way of overall examples, so L2, which is also LZ-18, lost just before the outbreak of World War I, was just under 160 metres long and could lift about 11 tons, travelling at just under 50 miles an hour. By halfway through the war, you had the Super Zeppelins, the R-Class, and the R-Class is just under 200 metres long. They can now lift 64 tons, and they can travel at just over 60 miles an hour. So, quite the considerable difference there. After this, you had a variety of Zeppelin classes that specialised at different things. So LZ-104, which we mentioned earlier, for example, is another nearly 30 metres longer than an R-class. It only has just over a third of the lifting capacity and a similar maximum speed, but of course it can travel much, much further. Another example would have been the S-class of Zeppelins, and they were basically capable of climbing to ridiculous altitudes fairly quickly, designed specifically in response to the advent of fighters that could catch the earlier and older Zeppelins. And then, as a final example, we have LZ-114, which was given over to the French at the end of the war and was basically almost brand new, renamed Dixmude, and did a whole load of various exploratory missions on behalf of the French, and this again was about 225 metres long and probably represented one of the pinnacles of German airship engineering, the X-class of a Zeppelin. Interwar, with the severe losses suffered by the Zeppelin Corps in World War I, there wasn't really much use for them. Also, the construction of certain airships was forbidden under the Treaty of Versailles because, of course, it was. To be honest, the only 2 really notable German interwar airships were the Graf Zeppelin, which was very successful in its primarily civilian role, going on various flights and world tours, and of course the Hindenburg, which is best known for, well, burning up in a massive fireball. There was one other airship, the Graf Zeppelin II, and that was built right at the end of the interwar period in 1938, and this was used in primarily military roles, although it was ostensibly built to carry passengers. It was mainly used for reconnaissance and electronic warfare testing in and around the North Sea coast. Unfortunately, the Graf Zeppelin and Graf Zeppelin II would not see any use in the Second World War, because Goering, if you needed any other proof that he was a fool, an idiot, and generally an evil man, also decided that he didn't like Zeppelins and that they would be too risky as prestige items in the Second World War, although that last part was probably technically accurate. And he ordered both of them to be destroyed, along with the unfinished LZ-131 in 1940. And then, in an even greater catastrophe, they levelled the massive hangars that they'd built for them with explosives. This is why we can't have nice things. To be fair, yeah, I don't see them surviving very long in the aerial combat operations around Europe in World War II. But one thing they did definitely miss out on would have been, once the Germans had completed their invasion of France, I suspect they really could have used those two for aerial reconnaissance in the Atlantic to help out the wolf packs, because Germany wasn't that good at long-range aerial reconnaissance, and the U-boats really needed the help. Yes, they had the WW2 Condor, but it was a converted passenger plane and really was not that suitable for the role. Obviously, you don't want to get a Zeppelin like this right up close to a convoy escort with modern anti-aircraft weaponry, but they could have done a lot of good long-range scouting. So yeah, there would have been a role for them, but Goering, what else can you say? Tree Shaker Tucker asks, were there any sailing vessels used in direct combat roles in World War I and World War II? Yes, there were, actually. Believe it or not, Germany's most successful World War I commerce raider, SMS Seeadler, was in fact a sail ship. And yep, it was armed with a few 105mm guns and sent out to raid commerce and shipping, and it was incredibly good at its job. One of the big downfalls of almost all German commerce raiders during both World Wars was lack of fuel, and guess what? As a sail ship, SMS Adler did not need to worry about this unless it particularly wanted to use its engines. And so the kind of engine troubles that would eventually do for the First War's SMS Emden, amongst others, and obviously the damage to the fuel supply that doomed Graf Spee in the Second World War, didn't apply to Seeadler. It quite happily sailed around the world, shooting at various targets that it happened to come across. And of course, the fact that it was a sail ship and therefore quote unquote obsolete actually worked very much in its favour, because of course, when you're looking for a successful merchant raider in the age of steam and steel, you tend to go looking for a steamship of some description. And if you happen to see a multi-masted old school sailing ship happily merrily sailing its way through the ocean, your first thought isn't, oh, that must be the really successful lethal German raider we've been looking for, and it just tended to get passed by. So yeah, that and a few other German ships were commerce raiders in the First World War. The Royal Navy also would use a number of sailing vessels as Q ships in the First World War, obviously to try and bait submarines up to the surface, although many of them weren't actually engaged in the manner that they were expected to be. In World War II, obviously, technology had advanced and sailing ships were becoming less and less common, but one particular force did end up still using sail ships in a combat role, and that was, believe it or not, the US Coast Guard. That's because on entry into the Second World War, they suddenly discovered that the US East Coast was a very, very large area, and U-boats were very good at hiding, and the existing US Navy force obviously having a lot of its attention drawn into the Pacific, as well as operations on the other side of the Atlantic, had nowhere near the number of ships it needed to actually patrol and guard the East Coast against German U-boats raiding merchant ships. And so various small sailcraft and auxiliaries were drafted into the US Coast Guard, a number of which were effectively yachts and would go on to find and hunt submarines, possibly even scoring a kill. So yeah, that's sailing ships in combat in the First and Second World Wars. If anyone knows of any other famous examples, let us know in the comments below. Mackinson asks, did the Soviet Navy during the Second World War have any plans for building an aircraft carrier or converting a battleship or cruiser into one? or did the Soviets not see any need for such a ship? So yes, the Russians had an on-again, off-again affair with aircraft carriers that never really took off until well into the Cold War. Pre-war, there was a battle cruiser, the Ismail, which they considered converting. It had been laid down during the Tsarist period, but it was the closest to completion of the planned battle cruisers. But the Soviet Union worked out that it didn't have the economic strength to build both a huge army and a huge navy, and since Russia's concerns were mostly land borders, the Red Army got the funding, and the idea of going and converting Ismail to an aircraft carrier, which to be fair would have been on a par with something like a US Lexington class, just didn't happen. But by 1938, Stalin had decided he wanted to compete with everybody at everything, and the Project 71 class was, well, started to be developed. The Russians called all their ships Project XYZ until they were built. Now, this was a relatively fast carrier, even by carrier standards, but relatively small based on the hull of the Chapayev class cruisers, and it would have been broadly equivalent to something like an Independence class carrier in the US Navy. They only planned to build a couple of them, but although approved the following year in 1939, World War II basically stopped construction on almost every major unit of the Russian surface fleet, and they never got off the ground. There's also Project 72, which was designed, depending on who you believe, to either be somewhere between an illustrious and an implacable class in dimensions, or much larger at a size that would have been more commensurate with some of the final versions of the Essex class. But as you might guess from the 10,000-ton variants in differently cited proposed displacements, there's not that much information known about this particular design, as it was dreamt up whilst Russia was in the middle of slugging out with Germany on land. The largest of the wartime designs was Project Kostromitinov, which was ostensibly a study based on the German carrier craft Zeppelin, but much enlarged to a 50,000-ton full load displacement. So you're talking sort of a midway size carrier at that point, which again didn't really get anywhere. Also, like the German design, it had quite a heavy anti-ship and anti-surface battery, which suggests that it was probably considered for use somewhere in Russia's western regions, as obviously the Russians have to consider operations in the North Sea, Arctic Sea, Baltic Sea, Black Sea, and Pacific, and those all have different operational requirements. You definitely don't need a heavy anti-surface secondary battery operating in the Pacific if you're an aircraft carrier, but if you're in the confined waters of the Baltic and the North Sea, well, I guess it probably made sense to them at least. Immediately post-war, the Soviet Navy went just a little bit crazy, and they wanted to have a very large force of carriers, presumably having seen what the American carrier task forces were capable of in the Pacific. They wanted 15 of the blasted things, but again, because of the various design considerations in their different operational environments, they wanted a mixed fleet of large and small carriers, with most of the big ones allocated to the Pacific Fleet, and the remaining large ones and a whole bunch of little ones allocated to their northern fleet to operate in European waters. This is kind of where the whole Stalingrad, Kronstadt battlecruiser force also came in, with one of their roles being escort of said massive carrier forces. But as will come as a surprise to exactly no student of history, this got precisely nowhere. So yeah, the Russians had lots of ambitions, and yeah, they didn't actually get anywhere with any of them. Mostly, to be fair, through industry limitations. Soviet shipyards just really weren't capable of building these kinds of things at the time. They made a try with the Svetsky Soyuz class, but battleships and aircraft carriers are slightly different things, and there's a lot to learn about operating an aircraft carrier from scratch. Well, as the Russians found out when they eventually did try and operate aircraft carriers in the Cold War, as we said. Vegard Faleth Hoyseta, I think. Sorry, I don't understand these letters with weird crosses and umlauts on them. Says, I was wondering if there was ever a metric of how much value you could get for your funds from each ship type, such as how much more naval power did you get for a carrier as opposed to using these funds to build a battleship. Unfortunately, this is one of those questions that doesn't really have a straight answer. It depends on two things, really. I mean, it's obviously an incredibly complicated field of study, but the two primary things it depends on is, one, who are you fighting, and what are they fighting with, basically, and secondly, how lucky is your ship? And this comes up so many times in various naval ships' careers that you would not believe. So, to give you some illustration of the second one first. So, take a destroyer. So, a destroyer is fairly cheap when it comes down to it, all things considered. It doesn't require that much of a large shipyard, doesn't require fantastically large weapons, and it doesn't require that many crew. So, low price point, and you'd think, yeah, I can get some good value out of this. I mean, it's not going to accomplish that much to make its money back, but at the same time, they're not really called tin cans for no reason. So, you might build your destroyer for a few $1 million, and you send it out there, and this is sort of World War II pricing roughly, and the next thing that happens is it gets blown up by a kamikaze. You didn't really get your money back on that one. However, you then might have another destroyer, and same price, same crew, costs, etc. And on one of its missions, it might go on to launch a spread of torpedoes that sink a heavy cruiser. That is a tremendous return for your money. Now, obviously, the higher up the sort of hierarchy of naval ships you go, the harder they are to sink, and therefore the more valuable and more reasonable things become, because with them being so hard to sink, unlike a destroyer that might just be wiped out by a lucky hit, larger ships take longer to go down, so it's fairly likely that they will hit back quite significantly and take some of the enemy with them. But then again, it's a matter of how do you define your value. So something like an Atlanta-class cruiser, when they're used in their proper role as AA ships, or really any other light cruiser by the sort of mid to late World War II period, it might deter numerous attacks by aircraft, and it might shoot down large numbers of aircraft. But in terms of direct damage that it's caused, if it comes out of the war with basically a kill tally of a dozen aircraft, it's not destroyed anywhere near the number of enemy aircraft in terms of dollar value compared to its construction cost. But at the same time, though that sort of guard duty might have prevented those aircraft from sinking one of your aircraft carriers or battleships, which are significantly more expensive than your cruiser. So your value there is more of a saved cost than a realized damage cost to the enemy. And then, of course, the flip side is, as we were talking about at the beginning, is what kind of enemy are you fighting? Because let's say the Tirpitz, for example, is quite often cited as a massive boondoggle, and the resources could have been used a lot better. Now, whilst it's true that the Tirpitz's weight in U-boats probably would have done more direct damage to the British and the Allied war effort, there is also the fact, and when we eventually get round to totaling up the Tirpitz damage video, you'll see this in graphical form. The Tirpitz tied down an awful lot of ships and forced an awful lot of operational expense that otherwise would never have been contemplated or considered. I mean, you had at any one time anything from 2 to 4 battleships and a couple of aircraft carriers kept around just because Tirpitz might sail. You had literally tens of thousands of sorties flown against it. You had entire new weapons lines, like the Tallboy bomb, developed almost entirely to sink it, along with the Royal Navy's midget-class submarines and the various associated bombing raids with those, and the midget sub-operations. The Tirpitz, although it never engaged enemy warships in actual combat, cost the Allies a stupendous amount of money and also an awful lot of missed opportunities, because obviously the ships and the aircraft carriers and the aircraft that were used to go after the turbits could have been used elsewhere. And you wouldn't use those resources against U-boats because they're just not suited for it. So in some ways, you could say, yes, Tirpitz was a bit of a boondoggle. It never actually did its intended mission. On the other hand, I'm pretty sure if you added up the cost, just the direct cost, let alone the opportunity cost of everything that it cost the Allies just trying to get rid of it and guard against its possible movements, it probably more than earned its money back. So yeah, this is where assigning value becomes very, very difficult. At the same time, the flip side of that is you look at the Japanese. What was the point of building the Yamato? I mean, yes, there is that whole thing of, yes, it was very big, and yes, it probably could have crushed almost any other battleship it ever met. But against someone like America, they were always going to just swarm it with planes, or if the planes had failed, just swarm it with battleships. So overall, that was a bit of a waste of money. I mean, if the Japanese had put the resources into building, instead of Yamato, Musashi, and Shinano, if they'd devoted those resources to building more carriers before the war and commensurately training pilots for them, they still would have lost, but they might have done a little bit better than they historically did. So I know I'm not answering your question directly, but as I say, it's because it's not really a directly answerable question. But if you wanted my particular opinion on which vessel you are most likely to get your greatest value out of, it's probably going to be the cruiser, I would say, because almost every other ship has fairly specialized roles, whereas your cruisers can do convoy escort, they can do carrier escort, they can do shore bombardment, they can fight other cruisers, they can fight destroyers, as we saw with the Scharnhorst last battle. They can also fight capital ships if you group them up in large enough numbers. They can take out commerce raiders. They can be commerce raiders, and of course sort of all sorts of numerous other roles, minor roles as well. So you will tend to find that every other type of ship in World War II can do some of those jobs much better, but can't do all of them. And since World War II, as the name implies, was a global war with almost every operational environment under the sun, I think you'll probably find overall that all navies got the most value out of their cruisers rather than any other kind of ship. That is not, of course, to say that you should have built an entire fleet based around cruisers. It's just that they were probably the most cost efficient. Matthew asks, in your opinion, what were the most important things that both Japan and the UK got out of the British air mission to Japan in 1921 through 23? Was it a failure in policy for the British to give Japan a bit of a head start in naval aviation when they both had competing spheres of influence? Well, you've got to remember that at the time it started, Japan and the UK were part of the rather aptly named Anglo-Japanese Naval Alliance. So it wasn't so much of giving head start to an opponent, it was more of a reinforcing an ally to provide a stronger united front. Although obviously, unfortunately, for various reasons, the alliance went the way of the dodo very shortly thereafter, mostly thanks to the Washington Naval Treaty. So yes, in hindsight, that was probably a bad idea, but there was no way they could have known that at the time. Well, for the British, there wasn't that much of a takeaway because the whole point of it was to help kickstart Japanese naval aviation, so there wasn't really that much for them to actually get out of it per se, except that they did hope to secure a huge arms deal by effectively helping the Japanese set up a naval aviation arm, which they would then be perfectly placed to supply with ships and aircraft and such like things, as they had done for Japanese naval interests pre-World War I, up to and including the first Congo-class battlecruiser. Unfortunately for them, that didn't really work out very much because, as was indicated by the construction of the other three Congo-class in Japan, the Japanese were very much determined to learn from the West and then do it themselves rather than stay dependent on the West. The Japanese, on the other hand, obviously benefited greatly. They got effectively a crash course in catching up on naval aviation developments, they were able to make alterations to their very first dedicated aircraft carrier, albeit that it had already been launched, so they weren't able to do that many radical modifications. And they got all the lessons in how to launch, operate, and attack with naval aircraft, which obviously would come back to bite everybody quite severely in World War II. They stayed fairly closely wedded to British carrier developments in the early part of the interwar period, and then kind of started to go off on their own, although they kept a very close eye on the British, and would take advantage of newer developments, because obviously with their own model built very closely on the British, it was fairly easy to reverse engineer new things in concept, at least, that they saw the British doing. And most notably, they also, by far and away, towards the end of that period, the most benefited from the fact that the leader of the mission, one Captain Lord Semple, well, he was a colonel at the time, but anyway, promoted to captain while he was helping the Japanese. He became a Japanese spy and would pass a bunch of critical information about technology and tactics over to the Japanese, right up into the Second World War, being finally brought down just before Pearl Harbor. So, yeah, not the British Intelligence Service's finest hour, to be honest. But yeah, that particular air mission, the Japanese got a lot more out of it than the British did. Brad asks, what was the development of night landings on aircraft carriers like? He says, figured out that landing on fixed ground would be tough enough in the period, but on an ocean it seems like volunteering for a suicide mission. Well, the first night landings on aircraft carriers were actually done surprisingly early in the development of aircraft carriers. Some sources differ on the exact dates, but it would appear, as far as I can tell, that the first night landings on an aircraft carrier were carried out by US Navy pilots on the USS Langley in 1925, albeit with the slight caveat that these are the first intentional landings, with apparently there being a slightly earlier landing in 1925, which was unintentional during night approach training when an aircraft stalled, unfortunately managed to fall onto the deck of the carrier. But there you go. With the Royal Navy following suit fairly quickly, either a couple of months later or about a year later, depending, again, I say, in which sources you go for, with deck landings on HMS Furious. Now, you might think night landing must be pretty damn terrifying, considering that they hadn't even quite really figured out how to land aircraft during the day, and yes, it was, but they did cheat a little bit. They made sure the carriers were lit up with the decks lit up with floodlights, and also they would make sure that these night quote-unquote landings were done either at full moon or around the time when the sun was setting, so there was a considerable amount of light. Although night landings would become standard part of a carrier pilot's training, they weren't done that often in any given flight year, and everyone tried to avoid them as much as humanly possible. Once wartime came around, it was like, yeah, that's a nice, neat trick, but no. Both sides in the Pacific War would lose substantial numbers of aircraft when aircraft that had carried out successful strikes during the day would show back up around their carriers at night and be unable to land, because obviously a tired, stressed out pilot with a potentially damaged aircraft is a very different thing to a fresh pilot who's concentrated and had plenty of rest in preparation for a particular exercise. And also, unsurprisingly, in wartime you don't really want to light up your carrier like a Christmas tree, which makes finding the ship even harder. And of course, there's no guarantee whether the moon is going to cooperate either by being there or at all, or being obscured by clouds, etc. This is why when the USS Enterprise in World War II started doing night operations, it was such a unique capability, because it was effectively the first full-size aircraft carrier that could regularly do this. Which was quite an impressive thing at the time. And just to give you another example of just how difficult night landings were, during one particular battle, Japanese aircraft flying around at night got so hopelessly lost they saw an aircraft carrier, decided it was one of theirs, and tried to land on it, only for it to turn out to be USS Yorktown. But then again, the Yorktown had no freaking clue what was going on either until right up at the last minute. We're like, oh, actually, those aren't our aircraft. Oops, better open fire. So yeah, it was done, and obviously it became a lot more common after World War II. By the time of the Korean War, it was fairly common practice. But the development of night landings pre-World War II was basically a case of trying to avoid them if at all humanly possible. And if you were told that you had to do it regardless, it was a case of screams internally and praying to whichever particular deity you favoured might bring you luck. Matt Blom and Lieutenant Simmons have similar questions, so I'm going to roll them into one. Matt Blom asks if the Germans had been allowed to keep, say, Bayern and Baden and develop capital ship technology without the Treaty of Versailles restrictions, could we have expected to see radically different German capital ship designs other than the Scharnhorst and Bismarck classes? And Lieutenant Simmons wants to know why said Scharnhorst and Bismarck classes did not adopt the all-or-nothing armour scheme, and also how do post-refit Gneisenau have affected the naval situation in Northern Europe? Well, the easiest bit to answer is the post-refit Gneisenau situation, or Gneisenau. I'm forgetting how I'm supposed to be pronouncing that blasted thing. I should go back and look at my own video on German ship pronunciation. But anyway, yeah, it would have affected things because, as we said earlier in this video, Tirpitz tied up a hell of a lot of resources, and having another 15-inch armed ship, basically just with one less turret, would have meant more resources devoted to containing-destroying it, and something like the Battle of the North Cape, assuming both ships could get out together, would have been a very different beast, because with a threat of two major capital ships breaking out, you wouldn't have just had Duke of York there. You would have probably seen something more along the lines of the escort groups that went out when Tirpitz was still around, where you'd have multiple battleships and aircraft carriers guarding almost every convoy that was sent. So yeah, that probably would have been its effect. As far as armour schemes and development of capital ships, yes, Scharnhorst and Bismarck class, their sort of somewhat distributed armour was partially a case of, well, this is the only kind of armour scheme we really know how to do, but partially also a reflection of their mission. Because remember, an all-or-nothing armour scheme is primarily designed around a engagement with a peer opponent, maximising your protection over the vitals at the expense of all else. Scharnhorst and Bismarck class ships were designed to be able to fight the enemy, but they also had a primary goal of commerce raiding in mind as one of their main missions. And when you come to that particular mission profile, then things get a lot more interesting, because in that mission profile you're likely to meet cruisers, 8-inch cruisers, 6-inch cruisers, destroyers, maybe armed merchant cruisers, that kind of thing. And remember that the distributed armour scheme was put in place mainly to try and resist secondary and tertiary caliber fire, as well as large caliber high explosive shells back in the old pre-Dreadnought and early Dreadnought eras. And guess what kind of explosives would be flung at you by convoy escorts? Well, there you go. Intermediate and low caliber shells and high explosives. And if you're going to be sailing around in a really big battleship, those kind of hits, which in a main battle are by far and away the least of your concerns when somebody's throwing a 14, 15 or 16-inch shells at you, in a convoy escort situation actually could be a major threat, because if you're in a one-on-one or fleet-on-fleet slugfest, you get hit by main caliber shells, and if you've got an all-or-nothing armour scheme, yes, your bows and stern might get riddled by small caliber fire, but you're in the middle, hopefully, of a fleet, or you can, even if not, you can just go straight home for repairs. If you're on a commerce raiding mission, you're in the middle of the Atlantic, or wherever, you're in the middle of a lot of very hostile, angry ships, the kind of speed effects that having your ends riddled with small caliber fire could have would be fatal, because they would slow you down far too much or rob you of your fuel, as Graf Spee found out. and also just with the sheer distances involved on commerce raiding missions as opposed to fleet missions, generally speaking at least, you would tend to have a lot more damage exacerbated by things like wind and wave action before you could get back. And obviously, you want to continue your commerce raiding mission. You don't want to have to turn back just after getting in a scrap with a little 6-inch gun cruiser or something. So in the context of that particular mission profile, the distributed armour practice makes a lot more sense because it means the ships are broadly capable of resisting the kind of light-scale fire they expect to find in commerce raiding missions all over the place, which would allow them to continue their commerce raiding missions to a much greater degree. I hope that made a bit of sense. And that kind of plays into the first part of the question by Matt Blom about what would the capital ship design be like. I don't think it would have deviated too much. I mean, if they'd been able to keep capital ship technology going, then I don't think the Scharnhorst class would have come out with the triple 11s. I think they probably would have gone straight to dual 15s. So certainly that would have changed things. But the overall profile of how they built ships, I don't think would have changed that much because ultimately, with a much smaller fleet, the mission role and profile is still going to be quite similar, which is going to lead to similar outcomes. The one thing that you probably would have, though, is that with the ability to keep up with capital ship technology and design, the German designs would have become a lot more efficient. So you might have got something like a Scharnhorst, but on significantly less displacement, and you definitely could have fit the Bismarck class into something with a lot less displacement. Or alternatively, if they were absolutely determined to build mid-30s of 1,000-ton or small battleships and sort of 50,000 ton-ish large battleships, then they would have been a lot more heavily armed and a lot more heavily armored. I can guarantee you that much. So yeah, it's interesting to consider what could have been, but I don't think what we would have seen come out of it would have been radically different from what we got. Just either more efficient or more scary in terms of weapons and armor. But the overall design profile of most ships, to be honest, is dictated by the mission, and the mission wouldn't have changed that much. Only 2 more questions left. So, Donald Fritz asks, how do the Gato class of subs stack up against their contemporaries? So, direct comparison isn't particularly easy because the only sort of contemporaries that you can really look at were actually developed a little bit before the Gato class. Gato class obviously being built in the 1940s and coming into commission mid-war. The 2 nearest comparable types outside of the Japanese subs, which I'm going to exclude because they were looking at a rather different mission profile for the minute. So the 2 most directly comparable subs would have been the Type 9 of the Kriegsmarine and the T class of the Royal Navy. Now, of these 3, the Gato class are by far the biggest by a long way. I mean, about 311, 312 foot long compared to just over 275 feet on a British sub, and somewhere in the region of between 250 and 280 feet on the Type 9, depending on the variant. So Gato's definitely got the advantage there. When you look at speed, the Gato has a 9-knot submerged speed, which is comparable with the T class and compared to the Type 9. Sorry, it's slightly faster than the Type 9. Type 9's sort of 7 to 8 knots submerged speed. Gato is also pretty much the fastest, 21 knots on the surface compared to just under 16 knots on the surface for the T class, and the German coming in the middle of the pack there about 18 knots. The flip side to that, Gato is middle of the pack when it comes to range, the shortest range being the T class at 8,000 nautical miles, Gato getting 11,000 nautical miles, and the Type 9s, once you get past the 9A, getting increasingly ridiculous, going 12,000 miles, then 13,450 nautical miles, right up to the Type 9D with an astonishing 23,700 nautical miles of operational range. And that's before we get into the Type 9Ds that were converted into cargo boats. The Gatos need the most crew. They have a combined total crew of 60. The T-class is the lowest at 48. The Type 9 is between the two figures, depending on whereabouts you are on the chart of Type 9s, whether it's 9As, 9B, 9C, 9D, 9D2, etc. There's a lot of different characteristics when it comes to evaluating submarines compared to surface ships, because we've talked a lot about their operational capabilities and a lot about their armament. But obviously, when you're talking about submarine, it's the operational capabilities are quite often the deciding factors. Test depth for the Gato is 300 feet, and that's pretty good for a ship of the time, or a submarine of the time, should I say. But the stronger pressure hulls of the T-class and the Type 9 actually beat it out quite significantly in this respect. In terms of armament, I'm going to ignore surface guns because really, World War II submarines, if you're using surface guns, either something's gone horribly wrong when you're using a submarine's surface guns. It's either gone horribly wrong for you because you're caught on the surface and there's nothing much more you can do other than try and desperately fight back, or something's gone horribly wrong to the enemy to the point that a submarine surfaced is capable of using its gun power without risk. So ignoring that, Gato carries a total of 24 torpedoes, with 10 torpedo tubes, 6 launching forward and 4 launching aft, giving it a good all-round coverage with a maximum single spread of 6. The T-class carries significantly fewer, only 16 torpedoes and no rear firepower, but it does carry 10 torpedoes facing forward, giving it a much better forward punch, but much less sustained. And the Type 9D Type 9 generally, coming in the middle of the pack again with 6 torpedo tubes, so the smallest number of torpedo tubes, 4 at the front, 2 at the back, but carrying 22 to 24 torpedoes, so more than the T-class, but with the smallest single spread of torpedoes with only 4 total at any one time. So overall, what does this mean? Well, it means that, as you can probably tell from the fact that everyone keeps switching positions, these kind of large fleet submarines were much of a muchness if you combine all their characteristics together, but they all have different strengths and weaknesses. So, for example, if I'm under a depth charge attack, I'm almost certainly going to want to be in a Type 9 or a T-class because they have much deeper test depths and therefore I'm much more likely to survive in them. One of the T-class actually survived a sustained depth charge attack that probably should have crushed any other sub, and it was a complete write-off once they got back to port, but the crew were alive, which is the important thing. Conversely, the T-class is fairly short range for a fleet submarine and has very low overall torpedo count, but has that absolutely vicious sort of alpha strike of 10 torpedoes. So if I was going to go for a general long-range fleet submarine for use against general enemy shipping, I would definitely want a Gato class because it carries the most torpedoes and it's got pretty nice 6 torpedo forward armament, and then I've got 4 more to pop off at people who might be chasing me, like escorts and such. So if I was to say which role each submarine was best suited for, I'd say Gato is probably your best bet at general merchant ship and enemy fleet interdiction. The T-class is going to be your specialist for going after warships and fleets because you basically just show up and go, hey, I have 10 torpedoes, bye. And that's likely to do a lot of damage. And then the Type 9 with its ridiculous long-range endurance is probably something you want more for extreme operations, cargo, and, well, as Germany ended up using them for, operating on the other side of an ocean when you have no ability to rest and resupply in anywhere but in your home territory, obviously with the exception of the odd milk cow U-boat. So, ironically enough, for the Pacific campaign, environmental factors aside, like heat, you might have been slightly better off with a Type 9, but the Gator was definitely something that you would want to be in a lot more than a Type 9 when you got attacked by any significant number of enemy warships, I can tell you that much. So there you go. Hope that makes sense. And finally, wrapping up what has become the longest episode of the Drydock ever so far is Scott Henson with the Royal Navy was quite big on blocking and separating the machinery spaces and main battery of battleships, etc., to reduce the size of the Citadel during the 1920s. So you have G3, N3, Nelson, etc. However, they went back to the more traditional layout of having machinery spaces in the centre and the main battery around it in King George V's. Why did they go back to this? Were the earlier designs considered failures? The experiments in the sort of all-forward configuration of the 1920s weren't exactly failures, but they came with their own disadvantages. One of which was that with the armament all concentrated forward, there was a technical possibility that a single really unlucky hit, especially to the centre turret or its barbette, might actually disable your entire main armament, which wouldn't happen with a fore and aft layout. There were manoeuvrability issues as well. With the superstructure so far back, it tended to mean that wind action would force the ship off course rather than just sideways. And it did mean that there were significant portions of the ship's arc left uncovered by the main armament. Now, back in the 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, when you're thinking in terms of a major fleet action, and especially if you're British, you're thinking of attacking during this fleet action, having the rear of your ship not be covered by your main guns is not really so much of a problem because, hey, you're going to be attacking, so who cares? But in an era of treaty limited battleships where you've got limited numbers and they may be caught isolated on their own or something like that, you really want the tactical flexibility to be able to fire all around your ship, and for that you need rear-mounted guns. There were also advances in technology and such like, and also, apart from anything else, the fact that the quadruple mountings like they were considering, there wasn't really any way to sensibly have all forward mountings for quad 14s, not on the hull design they were coming up with, although the US did actually test that concept with some of the early North Carolina ideas. Certainly, the idea hadn't gone away. As I mentioned, the North Carolina design studies, some Japanese design studies, which obviously in World of Warships Wargaming have kind of zombified and squashed into the shape of their Izumo class, and some of the British design studies as well. They were still all looking at all forward-mounted armament, and of course the Richelieus in the French Navy went for this setup as well, with the quad 14s at the front as well as the Dunkirk class. So there were still many adherents to it, and it still did have its advantages. But when they came to building the King George V class with the various advances in technology that had been made and the tactical considerations I mentioned earlier, a combination of that and just some and other general factors meant that it was preferred to have a more traditional layout on this particular class. Although there are rumours in some sources that at one point early on in its design cycle, even the Lion class, which was to be the King George V's successors, did have at least one design prepped where its 16s were basically all mounted at the front in a manner similar to just a modernised, updated version of the Nelson and Rodney, obviously with a significantly extra speed. I would have paid money to see that. I'd be interested in how they're planning to pull it off. But as I say, it's only rumours and mentioned tangentially in some sources, so I wouldn't put my money 100% on it actually being true, unless it was perhaps just one of the we considered it for the sake of having said we considered all options kind of things. So yeah, I believe should address that. And so everybody, at nearly 55 minutes, having clocked in, as I said before, the single longest episode of the Drydock ever, I will leave you to whatever it is you were planning to do with the last 20 minutes of your life. And I hope to see you again in the next video. Thank you very much, and goodbye for now.